All right, we're going to start our regular meeting, our regular board meeting, and first we will call the roll, please, Mr. Wilson.
Mr. Buckley,
Present.
Ms. Jisling,
Present.
Mrs. Roberts,
Here.
Mr. Tuttle,
Here.
Mrs. Briner.
Here, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. First, we will hear from our superintendent, Mr. Porter.
Thank you. Good evening, Madam President, members of the board, Heller family, Carrie, Stephanie, Michael, and to the family and friends of Steve who are here tonight. What a beautiful evening it turned into just as it was getting time to commemorate. In May, the board passed a resolution to rename the gymnasium behind me after Steve. It's so appropriate in so many ways. First, as we've reopened Ridge as an elementary building, it reminds us of his commitment to elementary education, particularly as the principal at Fairfax for so many years. Second, before my time here, also for many years, Steve was a physical education teacher and coach in this gymnasium. This deep understanding and passion for physical education and fitness for everyone helped to influence thousands of students right in this very space. He stands for everything right about Mentor Schools in this community. It is an honor to dedicate this gym in his name. At this time, we will hear from our board president, Mrs. Mary Briner.
Good evening. On behalf of the Board of Education, I want to thank you for being here tonight to join us in remembering and honoring a man who touched the lives of so many people in our Mentor Schools community. Dr. Heller was a member of our team of professionals for more than 35 years. He brought so much happiness and passion to our school community in all of his various roles: teacher, principal, and coach. As so many of you know personally, Dr. Heller was loved by the students, staff, and families that he worked with each and every day. Even after retiring, Dr. Heller stayed involved in Mentor Schools by continuing to coach. Thank you to Dr. Heller's family for being here this evening and for supporting him and his love for Mentor Schools through all the years. While his presence here with us is greatly missed, his connections are endless. Dr. Heller's joyful spirit can carry on through the thousands of people who he left with a positive impact on their hearts. It is our hope this gymnasium dedication can help be a reminder to those who enter it. Life is precious, and there is power of good. We are proud to call this the Dr. Stephen R. Heller Gymnasium, and let his legacy continue to have an impact on students for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Briner. And at this time, we're going to hear from someone on behalf of the family. That would be Mr. Chris Parsons.
Okay, I have to borrow a part of a historical address by Abraham Lincoln, who dedicated the cemetery at Gettysburg. It's altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. Dedicating this gym to Stephen is the ultimate tribute to a man who spent 20 years making this place his own. He spent hours in this gym teaching and coaching thousands of young men and women. There are actually 4 babies in Steve and Carrie's life: Aaron, Stephanie, Michael, and Ridge Jim. And he made sure that all received the attention they deserved. This gym, as I look around, I thought we were going to be in the gym, is all Steve. From the scoreboards he had Coke pay for, to the bleachers he had recovered to look nice and new, and then the floor that's laid out and how it's spelled. The curtain that separated the gym to help each PE teacher have their own gym, and even the chunk out of the floor where a student took a divot during his golf unit. Then there was the locker room where many football players received and heard his passionate game day speeches. And the locker room door where he emerged following Larry Luciano, myself, in a cheerleading uniform, a wig, and a full beard. Steve not only taught physical education, he taught life skills in this gym. and so many students and athletes have to thank him for pushing them to be successful and pushing them to find their mental toughness. Thank you, Mentor Board of Education. Thank you, Mr. Porter. Thank you, Mentor Public Schools. This is a fitting tribute to a great educator and friend to many. Thank you, Steve Heller, for setting an example of what educators, administrators, and citizens should be for our students and our community.
Thank you, Mr. Parsons. At this time, I would invite up Carrie and Stephanie and Michael if you would like to take part in unveiling the plaque that will be here for the remainder of Ridge Elementary's time. Just a little bit of a tug at the bottom of each corner should do it. So.
Maybe it'll do it.
And we would invite afterwards everyone to come up and take a look at this. But what it reads, so you know, is this gymnasium is dedicated to honor Dr. Stephen R. Heller's contributions as principal, teacher, athletic director, and coach, August 1983 through December 2017. His exceptional leadership positively influenced thousands of youths in the Mentor community. In this gymnasium, Dr. Heller would want you to live by the 4 FISH philosophies: play, make their day, be present, and choose your attitude. Board resolution adopted May 8th, 2018, dedicated this evening, September 11th, 2018. Thank you. We will be resuming the remainder of the board meeting at 7 p.m. this evening, but from now until then, we do have a reception, refreshments down in the cafeteria, which is down this way and to the left. We would invite you to join us for that for the next several minutes and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you for coming.
The September 11th, 2018 regular meeting of the Mentor Exempted Village Board of Education is called to order. This meeting is being held in accordance with Section 3313.15 of the Ohio Revised Code. Please join me in a moment of silence for 9/11. Thank you. I would like to welcome everyone to the September 11th, 2018 regular meeting of the Mentor Exempted Village Board of Education. Prior to this evening, each board member has received for their review and consideration the agenda and materials associated with each agenda item for the board's approval via the district's paperless Board of Education agenda system, Board Docs. The public can access the agenda through the school district's website. The agenda is available through the district's website for public viewing the Sunday prior to the board meeting. Board members have the opportunity to call the superintendent and chief financial officer for information concerning agenda items and to request, if needed, additional information. There are 2 places on the agenda when the board entertains comments from the community. The first hearing of the public is dedicated to those who wish to address the board on agenda items only. The second hearing of the public is dedicated to those who wish to address the board on any subject, whether it is an item on the agenda or another issue. When addressing the board, please state your name. Comments are limited to 3 minutes. Please address questions to the president. This meeting is being televised on a delayed basis and will be showed on Spectrum Cable, Channel 1026 in Mentor, and Channel 1025 in Mentor on the Lake. This meeting is also being videotaped and will be shown on our YouTube channel, Cardinal TV, Mentor, Ohio. Please place your mobile phones on silent mode during the meeting. I will have approval of minutes for our August 14th special education budget hearing and August 14th regular board meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. And we'll have hearing of the public on agenda items only.
I'm Cindy Langelier, Mentor Teachers Association President and resident of Mentor. I would like to speak to the first reading of the General Fund Reserve Fund that's being proposed tonight. I have some concerns about this fund. I think we've heard at the last couple of meetings a lot of accolades for the fund, but I haven't heard the hard questions being asked. I haven't heard the discussions. We have all this excess money, and we're just going to park it in a fund. Are we talking about improving buildings? Are we talking about increasing staff? Are we looking at the needs of the students, or are we just making a reserve fund? I haven't heard any of those discussions at these board meetings. I want to know what the rush is. We've talked about it for 2 meetings, and now we're having a first reading. I think we need more discussion. There's also, when I read this, the last sentence I find extremely concerning. The last sentence says, if the operating fund reserve balance falls below the target amount, the general fund shall transfer revenue into the operating reserve fund within 3 years, regardless of the current fiscal year performance. So what that says to me is, if we don't fund it fully, and we're talking 15% of the general fund, so we're talking millions of dollars, if we don't fund it fully in 2 years, we're just going to take the money out of the general fund. I think we need to talk about that. I'm looking forward to more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else for hearing of the public on agenda items? Okay, thank you. We will have superintendent's report and recommendations. Mr. Porter.
Good evening, Madam President, members of the board. I have the following recommendations listed under the consent agenda and recommend approval of items 6A1 through 6A3.
So moved. Second.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Roberts,
Yes.
Ms. Jisling,
Yes.
Mr. Buckley,
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle,
Yes.
Mrs. Briner.
Yes.
Thank you. Good evening again, Madam President, members of the board. It is an honor continuing to serve in this role again as we begin what we believe will be another outstanding year for the district. I want to take a few minutes to share some details with you in the traditional opening of school report. The first day of school is always a highlight, but extra special this year as so many students and their families were welcomed into new schools as a result of the reorganizational right-sizing that was planned. This right-sizing was essential as it allows the district to continue remaining fiscally prudent while also taking advantage of maximizing how we are equipped to best educate our students now and into the future. Besides so many students and families embracing the changes in such a positive way, this was a monumental undertaking by the staff of our district. I'm so appreciative of the administrators who organized the changes of personnel, transportation, financial planning, scheduling, physical plant modifications, and the logistics that were needed to make this work. So many teachers and other certified personnel were assigned new buildings with roles, and their grace, flexibility, and professionalism served as excellent examples for our students, many who also had undergone changes. Similarly, our classified staff members carried out so much of the physical transformation that took place, especially in these last 3 to 4 months. Their teamwork was very evident around the district as they accomplished so much in such a short window. Compared to the end of last school year, we have about 60 additional students at Fairfax, 90 fewer at Hopkins, 50 more at Orchard, 140 more at Memorial, 300 more at Shore, and relatively smaller variations at the other schools. Ridge, which has been transformed into an elementary school, has 784 students in grades K through 5. The net result of these changes is allowing each building to experience a comfortably full capacity with some flexibility for growth, but allowing us to make best use of the facilities we have. The closing of 2 buildings and the right sizing of the remainder of the district was necessitated by a gradual shift of where people live and the overall decline of school-aged populations over time. All buildings had upgrades of one kind or another over the summer, and some significant ones at the middle schools. But here at Ridge, the changes were most significant. Inside this building, more learning spaces were developed, particularly with the conversion of the former Media Center and former Industrial Arts Room. 2 beautiful classrooms for special education were transformed from the original locker rooms. Several small offices were opened up and converted into the new Media Center. A new front entrance foyer was built to enhance safety, and an elevated STEM room took the place of a former music room. These were just some of the internal changes. Outside the building, the parking lot was resurfaced and expanded to create more playground space, parking, and room for car drop-offs and pickups. A large new playground has come together with equipment from Garfield, Brentmore, and some new pieces as well. All of this serves as a backdrop to the new Ridge Elementary sign out in front of the building and to our new gymnasium named today after Dr. Stephen Heller. While the physical changes were important to create proper spaces around the district, the key to all the changes has been the flexibility of all the stakeholders involved. Students, staff, and parents have worked closely together to blend together as seamlessly as possible. As we set new routines and face some natural transitional bumps along the way, we will continue working to make students, staff, and parents feel at home in their new surroundings around the district. There is certainly comfort in knowing that we are all part of one united Mentor Public Schools, and that continues, as our mission says, to inspire students today to reach their potential tomorrow. Thank you. Any questions about the opening of school?
Thank you so much, Mr. Porter. The transformations that needed to occur and the cooperation of all those different individuals from transportation and custodial services, grounds, all of it working together, it was an amazing feat. And so I'm so grateful to everybody involved and that leadership that you contributed to make people feel clear and positive about what was going to happen.
Thank you. Thank you. Madam President and members of the board, I am recommending approval of agenda items C1 related to certified personnel and C2 through C6, all related to the human resource matters.
So moved.
Second?
Please call the roll.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes.
Thank you. Madam President and members of the board, at this time it is our privilege, again this month, to introduce our newest staff members to Mentor Schools. We are confident they will be outstanding teachers and staff members, and we're excited to have them join our Cardinal family. Mrs. Burnett will join me as we make the presentations.
Madam President, members of the board, Mr. Porter and Mr. Wilson. This evening, I'm very eager to introduce 2 additional new certified staff members and a new administrative hire to our team. First, I would like to introduce Ms. Christy Kolarczyk. Christy conducted her student teaching at Perry Elementary in a 3rd grade classroom. She received her bachelor's degree from Notre Dame College, where she played soccer while obtaining her teacher license. The past 4 years, Christy has taught preschool at Notre Dame Elementary. Christy has recently joined the Lake Elementary staff as a kindergarten teacher. She's a proud Mentor High alum and recently married her high school sweetheart. Congratulations.
Expecting great things from you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Snyder. Jennifer spent 12 years teaching for Columbus City Schools as an elementary teacher. She graduated from The Ohio State University and obtained her master's degree from Ashland University. Although she loved living in Columbus, Ohio, she was very eager to return back to Cleveland. Jen joins the Ridge Elementary staff as a kindergarten teacher. Congratulations.
Expecting great things.
Next, I'd like to introduce our new administrative hire, Brittany Majak. Brittany obtained her bachelor's degree from Ohio University as a speech-language pathologist. She soon realized she had a desire to be a classroom teacher and obtained her master's degree as an intervention specialist from Notre Dame College. Brittany spent some time as a behavioral therapist with the Cleveland Clinic, and in 2011, she was our first hire as an intervention specialist at CARES. She has always had a passion for working with students with autism and soon found herself emerging as a leader within the building. Brittany returned back to school to obtain an additional master's degree in educational administration from Ursuline College this past May. She is beyond excited to begin her new administrative journey as the Assistant Director of CARES. Congratulations.
She tricked us.
Sorry. Madam President, members of the board, Mr. Porter, and Mr. Wilson. It is an honor to have been chosen to be the Assistant Director of CARES. When CARES opened in 2011, I was fortunate enough to have been the first intervention specialist hired to work at this exciting and innovating new program. Under the direction of Mrs. Christy LaPaglia, I was able to see the program evolve and grow into a respective alternative educational program for students with autism. I'm looking forward to using what I've learned over the years and applying it to this new leadership roles to help CARES continue to grow. I believe that CARES and Mentor Schools is the best fit for me, and I thank you for this opportunity. Go Cards.
Expecting great things.
Thank you. That concludes my portion of tonight's agenda.
All right, moving on to Board of Education report and recommendations. Is this going to be, are we voting on this? Do you
Yes.
know? Okay. Sure, go ahead.
Well, thank you. As the district went into fiscal crisis in 2004, the board recognized the need to bring additional business perspectives to the fiscal management of the school district. As a result, the Citizens Financial Advisory Committee was formed to support the Board of Education with 4 primary committee charges: to annually review the forecasting assumptions and pass judgment on their reasonableness, share best practices from the private and public sector, serve as an audit committee when required, and to offer periodic reports to the board as it relates to the fiscal management of the district. The committee is composed of 6 citizen members who must bring with them a strong business background to the committee. We also have the superintendent and myself serve as ex officio members along with the board president and vice president. Over the years, this committee's been a valuable resource to the board to validate and offer independent judgment on some of the most important fiscal responsibilities that board has, and that's to adopt an annual operating budget and 5-year forecast, as well as to oversee any identified audit challenges. We've had 2 vacancies occur in the past few months due to one moving out of the district and another with a change in some life circumstances. And we solicited interest from the community, and once again, our community has been great at stepping up and offering to support the school district in many different ways. There was a selection process chaired by Mrs. Briner and assisted by Mr. Tuttle, and ultimately we determined to invite Adam Sandin and John Berlashik, that's close, I'm sorry, John, to join our committee as new members for terms that will run through December of 2020. So we would ask that the board approve their appointments formally. They will begin their duties immediately, and first up will be a review of the new budget for the fiscal year 2019 here in the next 2 weeks. And after the board votes, perhaps offer an opportunity if you want to share any comments.
Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Care to say anything?
Good evening. My name's John Berlashik, and it's an honor to serve on the Financial Advisory Committee. I'm looking forward to the challenges and meeting the objectives of the school district and the stakeholders, including teachers and students. And I'm hopeful, and I'm sure that we can add value to the process. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot. Next item. Do you have that, Dan?
Yes. Next on the agenda is a recommendation to enter into a settlement and release agreement involving a matter involving a student with special needs where we were required to go through a due process hearing and consider various factors. Through that process, we determined the best approach for supporting the student was to enter into this settlement and release agreement, and I think both we've previously distributed it to the board and believe it is something worthy of board approval.
Do we have a motion?
Are you going to say something?
No motion?
Oh, yeah. Oh, so moved. I thought Mr. Tuttle was going to ask a question, sorry.
Do we have a second? Do we have discussion?
Was there a second?
Discussion?
I didn't hear a second.
And it dies for lack of a second.
Okay. Any discussion on it?
Second.
Any discussion? Okay. Call the roll.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Thank you.
And next, we have 3 separate resolutions that are similar with the exception of the building discussed. It's for the board to declare formally there's no longer a need for the school buildings listed, the first being Brentmore Elementary, and authorizing us to proceed with an auction after proper legal notice.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes.
Next up is a resolution for James A. Garfield Elementary to declare it's no longer needed for public purpose, and we can commence with a public auction.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes.
And finally, a resolution to declare that DOR Rice Elementary is no longer needed for school purposes and authorizing us to proceed with the public auction.
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes.
And next is the first reading of policy 8.021, titled General Fund Operating Budget Reserve. This is a policy we've discussed the last couple meetings, and we've had follow-up discussions and data presented to the board to formally recognize a best practice recommended by the Government Finance Officers Association as well as the Ohio Association of School Business Officials to determine a formal general fund operating reserve that would allow us to fund extraordinary one-time needs, unexpected expenditures due to natural disasters or emergencies, or to avoid cash flow borrowing. The policy also provides a provision for replenishing the fund in years that general fund income exceeds general fund expenses within the first 3 years. We do not anticipate there would be many needs given the very structured type of expenditure that would require a board authority to use. We determined to request a 15% budget reserve based on discussions with the board and again looking at best practices and common practices and also translating that into days of operation, and we've determined a 15% budget reserve would fund up to 27 days of instructional days. So we are presenting this for a formal first reading for comments from the board with an intent to bring it back for a second reading and consideration for adoption at our October board meeting.
I'm in agreement that it makes sense to have a reserve fund. I'm not comfortable, though, locking into refunding the reserve within 3 years, regardless of current fiscal year performance. To me, that would be symptomatic of other problems, and I don't want to lay that into our policy that we are required to take out of the operating funds to fund a rainy day fund when there's current need. So I'm not comfortable with that portion of the policy.
Are you suggesting some other time period to replenish the
word
reserve?
regardless is the problem. So it would be worthwhile to transfer revenue into the operating reserve fund with a goal of 3 years, but the part that says regardless of the current fiscal year's performance seems to put the cart before the horse in my mind.
Would the way schools are funded in the state of Ohio, and we've discussed this many times, a district like ours that receives over 3/4 of the money from local taxes, there's a life cycle to our primary funding source. The 2016 levy was an addition of new funding with the expectation it would fund hopefully 5 and with some good fortune more than 5 years of budget, with the understanding in the first half of that cycle revenues are collected above current need, and then in the second half of the cycle expenses exceed revenue and you begin to draw down. When they're, again, for the restricted uses of the reserve for extraordinary one-time needs, unexpected expenditures due to natural disasters or emergencies, or to avoid cash flow borrowing, hopefully we never return to crisis days, that if the board embraces that as valid reasons to have a reserve, then there should be some mechanism designed to replenish it. And I'm hearing you say 3 years. is something that you have concerns about, but absent some predefined time period to replenish it, and depending on where we are in the levy cycle, it may never get replenished.
Well, that really lies in the hands of the voters in my mind. If we have a budget reserve fund and we make our community aware of the reasons for that fund, and the community doesn't see that as a worthwhile goal to just take it out of operating funds within 3 years regardless of current fiscal performance, I find that problematic. That's just
Okay,
my point of view.
So there would be no predefined time frame to replenish it? It would just be if revenues exceeded expenses? Is that what?
I just, regardless, the word regardless is the problem for me, is that we're talking about a hypothetical set of circumstances that forced us to tap the operating budget reserve, and that we're locked into replenishing that within 3 years, regardless of the current fiscal performance. I just,
Okay, for purposes of representing it to the board, what language would be struck or what language would replace what's there?
if it were my job to define it, I would say that we shall transfer revenue into the operating reserve within, with the goal of completing that within 3 years. That's just my thought. I'm not comfortable with locking ourselves in by a policy that we're creating for a new fund that we're creating, which is, I think, very good practice, but it's not something that everyone does anyway. This is something we're attempting to be proactive. It's a new strategy on our part to protect our fiscal viability, which makes good sense to me. But the operating reserve should not be the primary goal. The primary goal is good operations with the goal of maintaining the operating reserve. That's kind of how I see it.
So what you're proposing is that at the end of that, after the comma, the general fund shall transfer revenue into the operating reserve with a goal of replenishing within 3 years.
That's how I would place it, or that some other indicator that would be a measurable. So if the operating fund has additional dollars available, and you
Well,
know under.
Then let me read the entire last paragraph on this.
Okay.
In any fiscal year when total general fund revenues exceed general fund expenses, the surplus shall be deposited into the operating fund reserve until the target balance is achieved. So I think that's addressing what you just stated.
Yes.
Then the second sentence says, if the operating reserve balance falls below the target amount based on board-authorized one-time spending, the general fund shall transfer revenue into the operating fund with your proposed language now with a goal of replenishing within 3 years.
I would be very comfortable with that.
So again, that would preclude in the second half of a levy cycle when expenses exceed revenues, there would be no replenishing until a new levy passed, and then part of the new levy would be used to fund it.
That would be what I would prefer.
So if we could do that, I would also like to see a not to exceed on there, because the goal is to have that fund for emergency expenditures, and if we don't put an end on it, who knows what's going to come up that it's decided, oh, well, let's push it another year, let's push it another year. So I totally understand where you're coming from, Ginny, but we've got to set a time frame where we've got to put the money back.
So you're proposing that at the end of this, with a goal of replenishing within 3 years, but not to exceed something.
Exactly.
we've operated without an operating budget reserve these many years. And while I think it makes sense to have an end goal, the community does have some impact on everything because the majority of our funding is in the hands of our community. So I just don't want the operating budget reserve to ever take precedence over what is needed to provide for the best education for our students. So if we got to a point where the goal of a 15% rainy day fund was only possible if we sacrificed some other current valid educational need, I think we're allowing a best practice goal to be more important, to subordinate what our primary goal is, and that would be the highest quality education we can provide. I can't imagine that there really would be a circumstance where it would be impossible to fund the rainy day fund, the operating budget reserve, but I don't know that, and I just don't want to lock into our policies that this ever trumps the rest, especially since this is new. And maybe down the road, we foresee that locking in an end date or a more rigid refunding protocol, then maybe we revisit it. I'm just talking from my point of view. The word regardless seems to have too much power when this is a safety net, not the net. That's just my thinking.
Well, just if I may respond, I don't want to jump in front of board members, but again, just as I read the committee charge for our Citizens Financial Advisory Committee, and we recognize utilizing best practices, one of the reasons this is a recommended best practice by national government associations as well as our state school business official association is that absent an operating fund reserve, when a district gets to the end of the life cycle of a levy and an extraordinary one-time event occurs or some natural disaster occurs, and we've seen that happen here in our own area with high school roofs blown off, with fires to buildings with a 2-year delay to settle up with an insurance company, that absent a reserve fund, some of those same challenges you just outlined of where's the competing interest if we cannot operate our current instructional programs because of this extraordinary one-time event, we end up in the same place, in my judgment, as what you suggested, if there is a predefined timeline to replenish. That this is to allow us to buy time to adjust for an extraordinary one-time event or a natural disaster so that there's not an immediate negative impact on teaching and learning. So I think it's designed, and the best practice recognizes that, but also if you believe that's important to provide a safety net, if you will, then if you don't have the safety net strengthened to withstand this extraordinary one-time event or natural disasters, then we have that same challenge in a different way.
You know, having been through fiscal emergency, I don't want to be in the position of having to let go over 200 teachers and watch career teachers, young teachers' lives be destroyed. The community, it was a terrible time. And so I want to underscore the need for this safety net fund. And the other thing is the 3 years sets a process to replenishing the fund. Now, just because we adopt a policy does not make it in stone. The board can make adjustments based on fiscal prudence or things that are happening. This is just the first blush, and it's new, and there could be more and more data and information coming out. But I want to underscore the importance of being fiscally responsible, and also it responds to one of the goals of our strategic plan.
Could we set it at a levy cycle then, rather than 3 years?
Not following.
Our levy cycle is, we hope for 5.
Our last one was 12.
But
Last one
again,
was
depending on when there will be a need to access the reserve fund, we could be anywhere in that levy cycle.
Correct, but 5 gives us a full levy cycle
So you're
to address the
proposing
need.
5 years rather than 3 years?
Either that or don't make regardless. So an end game, the goal could be 3, but an end point maybe is 6 years or something like that, then for,
So back to Mrs. Roberts'
yeah, what-
suggestion, but not to exceed some number of years.
not to exceed, let's say, 6 or 7. I just don't want to have something that's new to us, although I think it's completely worthwhile and makes sense, especially given our own history here, that we had extraordinary, unexpected catastrophe those years ago. Although this wouldn't have addressed that. This wouldn't be enough to fix that problem. But I just think it's a wise idea to have a rainy day fund. But I just don't want the rainy day fund to be the primary driving goal. I want it to be subordinate, as of course it should be, is. But
Jenny, we set the budget. So that could reflect, the need for more teaching instruction and adjust it. So it's not like the budget continues and there's no say. It's
Oh,
a fluid,
absolutely.
moving, situation,
But
and
to
we
your-
have control over that.
And you're absolutely right. So to your point, Ken, it would be, so we're going to transfer the operating reserve fund within 3 years, period. And then it is the board's responsibility, in response to the chief financial officer, who says, we're not going to have it replenished. What do we want to do about it? And then we cross that bridge when we come to it. So just dropping the regardless in the rest of that sentence, just we're going to replenish that either with a goal of 3 years or within 3 years, but take out the regardless caveat.
I think that works.
Since the board's responsible for, with your recommendations, making decisions, so our fund's going to drop down to so many days. Our goal was 15%. We're not going to make it if we don't address that in this new budget cycle. Then you would advise us, Dan, and we would make the changes accordingly and would refer it back to our own policy, but just not setting it in stone with a regardless.
I'm not sure I totally follow. To Ken's point, the board makes policy, the board can modify or change policy. If the replenish process needs to be addressed, one way or the other, the board ultimately has to decide. They approve a budget that includes the repayment mechanism to replenish the fund, or they address it through modification to the board policy or an exception to the board policy. That either way, the board still has the ultimate authority to do it. But again, looking at best practices and the discussions we had leading up to tonight's meeting were to model a policy that said that if there's a valid need to have a reserve fund for these extraordinary one-time expenses or respond to natural disasters, then if that reason's valid, then you need to find a way to have the fund remain funded for that purpose.
And you could still stop the sentence there, and it still means exactly what you said.
But it's, with all due respect to me, it doesn't say the same thing. It says you can spend it, but you don't have to put it back in.
It says that if it
In-
falls below the target amount, the general fund shall transfer revenue into the operating reserve fund within 3 years.
Period.
I thought you were changing that with
Would-
saying a goal.
Well, we just drop, so 3 years period, and then if the chief financial officer and whoever's on the board at the time, if it looks like you can't replenish that fund, then that becomes a point of discussion.
Yes.
Whoever the board members are, because they
Yes.
won't have been necessarily privy to this moment in time where we discussed it. So you say, well, the goal was set 3 years, we're not going to make it, and this is why. Maybe it changes the levy cycle, or something else has to change. So I just don't see putting regardless of the current fiscal year performance is necessary.
But, all right, I'm still not clear. So we're discussing, the last line would read, shall transfer revenue into the operating reserve fund with a goal of replenishing within 3 years? That's what you're proposing?
That's what I would propose.
But again, a goal doesn't require that action.
So I think that what you're talking about, Ginny, and I like the way it ended at within 3 years, but don't put the goal. Because at that
You
time.
could say within 3 years. I would-
Within 3 years, period.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
So,
Then it becomes a point of discussion between the
Shall- Right.
CFO and the board.
okay, so now for second reading, the last sentence will read, if the operating fund reserve balance falls below the target amount, the general fund shall transfer revenue into the operating fund within 3 years,
Period.
period.
Right. And it might be valuable to have our citizen advisory committee weigh in when you meet
Sure.
with them. I think that would be a good discussion to have to introduce our financial advisory committee. Because you see things from a different perspective certainly than I do.
No, but we are stewards for the community.
We are stewards for the community, but having their expertise and their financial understanding, they may see it with a different shading that would be worthy of our consideration.
Happy to add that to the agenda for a September meeting.
Thank you.
So do I understand then to bring this back for a second reading in October with the recommendation to adopt, knowing that the Finance Committee will meet in September and could offer any thoughts, but it will come back again with the last sentence reading, if the operating fund reserve balance falls below the target amount, the general fund shall transfer revenue into the operating reserve fund within 3 years.
That's what I would,
That would be the
is that good with you?
policy for second reading.
Then if the financial advisory committee has other thoughts, you could bring that for
could,
discussion
yeah.
before we do a vote.
Yeah, you could, after a second reading, determine to have a third reading rather than proceed with the vote. Yes.
And I would like their overall opinion on having a reserve, Dan, if you can present that to them and just kind of get their feedback on that.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for
Thank you, Ginny.
belaboring that with me.
On to Tom's part here.
All right, so no further discussion on that. Are we good?
You know how I love to be.
All right, moving on to legislative report, Mr. Tuttle.
Yes, I'd like to cover one topic. School district and building report cards are set to be released this week. Excuse me. This week, Ohio's public school districts and buildings will receive an overall letter grade on their state report cards. This summative rating will be based on 6 weighted components and is derived almost exclusively from state test scores. Superintendent of Public Instruction, Paulo Di Maria, last year said, "Report cards are just one element of what is happening in a district or school." To get a fuller picture, I encourage, as well as so does Paulo, encourage people to visit schools and talk to teachers, administrators, parents, and students. A lot of great things are happening every day. To help achieve that goal, the Ohio Department of Education invites districts and schools to provide a web link to a page highlighting local information and achievements. The link to this profile will be placed on the district details page of each report card, just below the school's address. So I wanted to share that with you. The report cards are moving forward, information, and I want to reinforce that the community, people should visit the schools and feel good to talk to teachers, administrators, parents, and students, and also come to our school board meetings. So I'm speaking to the public right now who might view this on our webpage, also on TV. Mrs. Briner mentioned what station, so community, come out and get involved. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, I'd also like to say that locally, we have standardized test data as well as local data that answers the question, how are our students achieving? And you have to look at the state test as just another picture or part of that data, but it is postmortem data that's a year old, and it's better for us to look at all our data points, but especially what's happening now.
Very good. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Tuttle. Moving on to Chief Financial Officer's report and recommendations, Mr. Wilson.
Yes, it's recommended the Board of Education approve agenda items 8A through D, approval of the monthly financial statements, approval of August investment transactions, approval of interfund transfers, and approval of certain invoices. The monthly financials are still based on the temporary budget, so there aren't a lot of variance analysis that will be useful, but so far the tax advance on second half collections was greater than last year. With that exception, relatively normal first 2 months of the fiscal year.
So moved.
Second?
Please call the roll.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes.
Completes my report.
Thank you. Any unfinished business? New business?
Yes, I'd like to ask the board to consult their schedules and determine a time to meet. We have a tentative meeting date for the Citizens Financial Advisory Committee of September 24th, subject to confirming some calendars. We would like to ask the board to meet sometime after that to consider adopting the operating budget. We've done that sometimes in the morning or sometimes right after work. Whatever would best suit the board's schedules would be fine.
This is after the 24th?
Correct.
Are you looking at that week, Dan?
We could, yes.
I'm gone that week.
It must be adopted before September 31st, so sometime that week. And I can certainly work with you and give you a full briefing before you're gone.
Will you be back Saturday, or you'll be still gone
I'm gone the 21st of September till the 30th.
till the
30th.
30th? Okay.
Time 25th through the 28th, either first thing in the morning or in the evening. Typically, it's less than a half-hour meeting to do the high-level review and share the Finance Committee's recommendation. The October forecast has a more detailed presentation to it normally.
I'm pretty flexible that day, other than I can't do the afternoon on the 27th.
What day are we talking?
25th through 28th?
Well, early morning's always good for me.
Is what was that?
Early mornings
Is you like that?
is always good for me.
What's her preference?
That's for you. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm
Otherwise,
happy
Tuesday and
to
Thursday.
accommodate my hardworking
Tom's
colleagues.
flexible. Tom's flexible now.
You pick.
Tuesday,
Tuesday morning?
the 25th?
Just not too
25th.
early.
Well, I mean, or after work. I'll let you people enjoy your sleeping in.
Oh, how about after work then?
I'll be 6 hours ahead.
Oh,
Yeah, after work on the 25th? Could you?
And do you need all 5 board members? Because I'm going to be out of state till October 5th.
No, we need 3 board members to officially approve, and again, be happy to provide a full briefing and review in advance, and then email the committee recommendation immediately there, so.
So would afternoon be okay with you, Tom? On Tuesday afternoon, is that okay with you?
That's fine.
And Dan,
Yep.
that's okay with you? Okay.
Yeah.
So you pick the time there, Dan.
5 PM, is that
5 PM.
It's a
Is that
date.
okay for you,
is
Dan?
that acceptable to everyone?
Yes.
All right, September 25th, 5 PM. Thank you very much.
At the Cardinal Room?
Yes, Cardinal Conference Room.
All right, thank you. All right, next we'll have hearing of the public on any item. None? And we are going into executive session for an expulsion appeal hearing. We're not going to be voting on anything.
Yes, we may take action on, if the board makes a decision on, after deliberating on the hearing. So it is possible the board will reconvene and take action.
Okay. So I will hear a motion for adjournment to executive session.
So moved. Second?
Please call the roll.
Who moved, Tom?
I think
Yes.
it's Tom.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. We're in executive session. And we're reconvene. Mr. Wilson, will you please read the resolution?
Yes. Whereas the Expulsion Review Committee unanimously recommended that Xander Zahan be expelled from the Mentor Public Schools for a period of 45 days beginning August 30th, 2018 through November 2nd, 2018 for a violation of Board of Education Policy 6.19 regarding the use or possession of weapons and dangerous instruments. Whereas Ms. Cynthia Saymack, mother of Xander Zahan, timely appealed the decision to expel Xander Zahan from the Mentor Public Schools. Whereas in accordance with the Mentor Board of Education Policy 6.18, a hearing was scheduled for September 11, 2018 at Ridge Elementary School, 7860 Johnny Cake Ridge Road, Mentor, Ohio 44060, and written notice of such hearing was provided to Cynthia Saymack, Xander Zahan, and Mr. and Mrs. David Sedmack. Whereas on September 11, 2018, the hearing was held in executive session, and such hearing was recorded in accordance with Board Policy 6.18 and Ohio Revised Code 3313. Whereas after conducting the hearing and after deliberations in executive session, the Mentor Board of Education wishes to affirm the order of expulsion. Resolved that the order of expulsion of Xander Zahan is hereby affirmed. Need a motion and second.
Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Please call the roll.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Please call the roll.
Mr. Tuttle?
Yes.
Ms. Jisling?
Yes.
Mr. Buckley?
Yes.
Mrs. Roberts?
Yes.
Mrs. Briner?
Yes. Thank you.